chapters 22 to 24 of the Westminster Confession of Faith. We're looking at a new group of chapters today, so it might help to see where we've progressed in our overview of the confession. Chapter 1 dealt with the authority of the Scriptures. Chapters 2 to 5 with who God is. Chapter 6 examined the nature and consequences of sin. Chapters 7 to 15 looked at God's plan to save us. Chapters 16 to 21 looked at the individual's experience of faith, that is to say, the Christian life. Now, it would be a clear and logical progression to end then with a treatment of how we experience our faith together as a church. Or it would end that way except for two modifications to this structure. First, though we may not have noticed it at the time, the framers did not complete the subject of salvation. There is one more piece, and that is Christ's return. They chose to reserve that to the very end, and I imagine this was for an aesthetic or poetic effect. It's nice to end with how Jesus will wrap up this age and inaugurate a new one. But they also wanted to deal with one additional subject that didn't naturally fall into any of the other categories, and it's the relationship of Christianity to the state, to the civil government. And since that subject touches on both the Christian life and the church, they inserted it right between these two subjects. And this is today's topic, chapters 22 to 24, Christianity and the State. Well, let's begin with a summary of the points found in this segment. Chapter 22, of lawful oaths and vows. If we were writing a confession today and wanted to talk about Christianity and the state, I can think of lots of contemporary topics that you wouldn't expect to find in a 17th century document. But why did they include a chapter on oaths and vows? That does not seem to us to be something of huge importance. The answer has to do with the lessening impact of the Christian faith on Western civilization. Our civilization has always depended on a shared moral foundation in order to function. And a shared moral foundation almost always comes from religion. In the West, that has been Christianity. Not that everyone in the West has what the Bible calls saving faith, but society has been externally shaped by a Christian worldview. And part of that worldview is the concept of divine judgment. That God is the basis for good and evil, and at the end of this age, God shall judge the morality of all mankind. Because of that, a fundamental aspect of any social contract, from the military to legal obligations to marriage, is the need to take people at their word. And one of the principal ways we've done that is through oaths and vows. These are ways to anchor our commitments to confidence in God's final judgment, that God will witness to what we say and hold us accountable. Modern America no longer embraces this worldview. There is no pervasive or shared fear of God. Our civilization has substituted the threat of litigation in place of the fear of God, making oaths and vows, whether in a courtroom or in a marriage, much less relevant. Christians, of course, are called to think very differently. We are confident that God will respond to how we handle our commitments. Section 1 defines an oath as calling upon God as a witness to one's testimony. When people say, "So help me God," that's an oath. It's a form of swearing. Today, swearing is another word for blasphemy because people don't take invoking God's name seriously. But an oath does seriously attest that I'm promising that what I say is true and it's honest, and I call God to witness to that fact and hold me accountable. Section 2 says that an oath should only invoke God's name, not anything else, and that it is proper and just to have oaths in very important situations. In fact, when official testimony is given in the Presbyterian Church of America, it is still true that, and I'll quote the Book of Church Order here, all persons of proper age and intelligence are competent witnesses, except such as do not believe in the existence of God or a future state of rewards and punishments. In other words, we accept testimony only from people who can meaningfully call God to witness their testimony, their honesty, and hold them accountable. Section 3 says that we are obligated to make oaths only to what we believe is true, nothing else. In essence, an oath is a kind of a sworn promise that our testimony is true, or that I truly intend to do what I claim I will do. Section 4 says that oaths must be simple, they must be plain, and without any attempt at deception, and that we are honor-bound by what we swear. Section 5 introduces the concept of vows, saying that vows are similar to oaths, so everything already said applies to them too. Section 6 tells us the difference. A vow is a promise to God. An oath involves promises to other people, calling God as my witness. A vow is a promise made directly to God. You might vow to do something out of thanks to God, or in pursuit of a blessing that God says He wants us to have, like marriage. Vows are serious because we commit ourselves before God to doing what we say. That's why Section 7 goes on to say that it's very important to note that it's wrong to vow anything that God forbids or has not clearly indicated that He would support. Chapter 23 is of the civil magistrate. Since the Reformed faith played a part in the formation of the United States, most of these points will be familiar. Section 1 says that the government, the civil magistrate, is authorized by God to use force in society. It bears the sword, to use the biblical phrase, for two purposes. In other words, God instituted government for two purposes. One is to restrain sin, not eliminate it, but restrain it enough for civilization to exist so that the Great Commission can finish its job, and to encourage the best in people. The confession does not assume that civil leaders are Christian. Section 2 says, however, that Christians may hold such offices, and if they do, they must be careful to promote justice for all and peace for all, and as Christians also promote piety, that is, respect for God. One specific role is highlighted to avoid confusion, that if it is truly called for, Christians in government may wage war. Section 3 says that the civil government has no authority whatsoever to direct spiritual affairs of the church. It's improper for civil authorities to seek to influence the church's doctrine in any way. The civil government should protect the freedoms of the church without any preference given to any denomination. Now, the only exception would be to restrain people who obviously use religion as a means to injure or abuse people. The government has a valid interest in suppressing abusive authoritarianism, even when it claims religious authority. Section 4 says, for our part, Christians, individually and together as churches, and this includes clergy, must honor, must pray for, and must submit to civil authority as it does what God calls it to do. Given when it was written, it's not surprised to see a special comment declaring that the Roman Catholic Pope has no right to claim authority over civil government. This is a statement concerning the separation of powers between church and state. The church has spiritual authority, and we'll examine that later in the confession. The state has civil authority. Both draw their validation from the same God, and they may not encroach on each other's sphere of influence. Chapter 24 of Marriage and Divorce. So where does marriage and divorce fit in? Under the church or under the state? That's kind of a gray area. Until the mid-1800s, supervision of marriages was the sole responsibility of the church. Churches conducted marriages, they kept marriage notes and rolls, they governed divorce, but even then, the state was always involved because the state has valid interest in many issues influenced by marriage: property rights, physical abuse, child custody. Today, the state has almost completely taken over the church's role. The state licenses marriage, quite literally, keeps all records, And now the state has presumed to define what marriage is, which is a clear infraction of what the Confession and the Bible teaches. In the state's defense, it has to have clear rules about marriage, and the influence of the church has dramatically declined. And when there's a power vacuum, the state will always step in to fill it. The Confession expresses our view of what the Bible teaches and how we will proceed as the church. Section 1 says that the structure of marriage is one man and one woman, heterosexual by definition, monogamous at any one time, which is to say that death and divorce do end marriages. Section 2 talks about the purpose of marriage, and 1 is God's design for navigating life. Marriage is not commanded, it's not required. But when done properly, marriage best enables people to deal with life's typical challenges. When people get married, they commit themselves to a team designed to live life well. Marriage also exists to raise children and families. It's God's design for the family. When people get married, they take on some obligation to prepare the next generation. And marriage exists to discourage immorality, to provide the proper context for sexual give and take, a context for intimacy and shared joy. Section 3 says that anyone can marry. I think it's talking about there are no restrictions on race or nationality, but there are 3 restrictions. 1 is that people must be able to give reasonable consent, which has implications for age. 2, Christians ought only to marry other Christians. Now, a marriage is valid with non-Christians, but God instructs us to marry in the faith. And again, with a nod to its own day, the Confession specifically warns against marriage to Roman Catholics because of doctrines embraced by the Roman Church. Section 4 talks about the 3rd restriction, and that is that people may not marry if they're closely related, and that parallels teachings in the Bible. Section 5 reflects the biblical understanding that engagement is a promise. And to break an engagement is to break a promise. Well, what justifies breaking the promise of an engagement? If one engaged party commits fornication, which is intercourse with someone else, then the engagement may be dissolved. And it goes on to compare this to immoral intercourse in marriage. Once engagement is consummated in marriage, immoral intercourse is not called fornication, it's called adultery, and that is grounds for dissolving a marriage, except we don't say dissolve, we say divorce. Section 6 concludes by rounding out the grounds for divorce. We've already seen that one ground is adultery, a refusal to honor the one marriage vow of sexual faithfulness. The other ground is desertion, which is a refusal to honor the other marriage vows. We're not talking about a temporary spat. We're talking about a situation that neither the church nor the state can remedy. Both are involved because divorce causes problems in both realms. These 3 chapters lay out the Confession's teaching concerning the state and Christians, both individually and corporately as a church. The chapter on the civil magistrate contains basic principles which are fleshed out in 2 examples of personal responsibility: our promises in general, oaths and vows, and our marital promises in particular. God's kingdom, where God rules, is everywhere. It is over all. He controls all things. His rightful rule extends throughout the universe. The kingdom of mankind, or kingdom of this world, is a rebellious territory. God is still in control, but he allows our willful rebellion in order to allow us to willingly leave the rebellion by enabling us to come back under his rule through faith. To be a bit more specific, each of us lives in a particular civil realm, with a government authorized by God to limit sin and encourage goodness. None of these governments are perfect. Sometimes they become so corrupt that God doesn't allow them to continue. But the point is this: every Christian lives under some civil management, some government ordained by God, and we are responsible to honor and submit to that government. But look at the diagram. Christians have also been welcomed back under God's rule. They now consciously live in His kingdom too, which is over all. The confession understands that God has set up general principles about how we can wear our two hats, how we can pursue our two citizenships. The first principle is that we obey God always, in everything. And the second principle is, in civil matters, God's will is for us to honor and submit to government. The government is there for all people's benefit, and God expects us to cooperate with its charge to limit sin and encourage the good. In practice, the civil government has no valid authority over church doctrine or the essential ways that we practice our faith. Now, it may sometimes claim such authority, but we will not recognize it. The church, on the other hand, has no authority to try to do the government's job. The church may not bear the sword. In other words, we have no coercive power. And Christians, both individually and as a church, must obey God by honoring government as it does the job that God gave it. While Christians may serve in government, we are just as responsible to honor unbelievers who fulfill that role as well. Next time, we'll start a two-part study of the Church, considering chapters 25 and 26 of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Till then, God bless.